Today's webinar has two main purposes. They are to help members of the public and civil society organisations better understand the laws on lobbying and how to enforce them, and to discuss what changes need made to lobbying laws. The webinar is going to be divided into two parts. So I'll be giving you a quick spiel at the start, after which we'll be hearing about the enforcement of the Lobbying Scotland Act 2016 from Ian and James. The second part of the webinar is going to be looking at the application of the Act in practice and whether it needs strengthened. We'll hear from Ric and Juliet. Each speaker has 10 minutes for their presentations, and then there will be 15 minutes Q&A after each part of the webinar. So there will be two Q&A sessions, one after the enforcement part and one after the second part. If you have any questions as we go along, you can put them in the chat, or you can send me a message through the chat as well. So to get us started, what is lobbying? It's really about trying to persuade someone in authority to support particular laws, policies, or decisions. And often that's about supporting laws, policies, or decisions that give someone's interests or industry an advantage. But also vice versa, it can be about frustrating or opposing laws, policies, or decisions that might harm interests or industries. And this matters because there are legitimate concerns in Scotland about the overbearing influence of powerful vested interests. There are concerns that those with the deepest pockets are able to influence politicians and decision makers in ways that are often at odds with the interests of citizens. We don't have to look very far to find examples of this in environmental law and policy. Lobbying is at least partly responsible for the defeat of the proposal to introduce a deposit return scheme. The alcohol industry in particular lobbied decision makers over their concerns as to how a DRS would affect their business. In Juliet's Spirited Away article, which discusses this, she found that in 2022 and in early 2023, environmental NGOs which supported the introduction of a deposit return scheme, they had 12 meetings with MSPs and ministers, whereas trade organisations that had concerns about the introduction of that scheme had 218 meetings. We also know that industrial scale lobbying by the fossil fuel industry goes on all the time as they seek to continue extracting fossil fuels and to see off attempts to regulate them. And we'll be hearing more about that from Ric in the second session. The main law that we have to regulate lobbying in Scotland is the Lobbying Scotland Act 2016. Its philosophy is really one of improving transparency of lobbying. It requires that lobbying is to be recorded and carried out transparently. The theory behind that act is that shining a light on lobbying should allow the public to hold politicians to account. Citizens are left to make decisions based on the information that the Act requires to be published. So a very quick overview of what the 2016 Act says and does. It applies to regulated lobbying. I'm not going to get into what the definition of regulated lobbying is, because I think a couple of our speakers are going to be covering that in their presentations. And regulated lobbying has to be recorded in the Lobbying Register, which is a public register maintained by the Clerk of the Scottish Parliament. Anyone can access that. There's also an enforcement regime to give the Act some teeth. So the Clerk has a duty to monitor compliance with the Act. The Ethical Standards Commissioner can investigate and determine complaints of alleged breaches of the duties in that Act. So, for example, if someone's been carrying out lobbying that hasn't been properly recorded. And the Act also contains provisions for fines for those that are found to fail to comply with their duties under the Act. The fines, however, are surprisingly low. If you fail to comply with your duties under the Act, you can expect a fine of up to £1,000. And I can't imagine that many commercial lobbyists in Scotland would be getting out of bed for less than £1,000. So I'm not sure what sort of deterrent effect that has in practice. Which is a nice segue onto the limitations of the 2016 Act. It's an act which is far from perfect, and we'll be hearing about that in the second part of this webinar. But just some of the limitations include that regulated lobbying covers only communication which has occurred both verbally and face-to-face. So the Zoom loophole that I've referred to in my slide here refers to the fact that a Zoom call where you have the video switched off does not appear to be regulated lobbying, which would have to be recorded in the lobbying register. Also, lobbying of key decision makers is not regulated lobbying. So lobbying senior civil servants and regulatory bodies like SEPA, who are important decision makers, that type of lobbying would not have to be recorded, but it is important. And the money spent on lobbying is also not required to be recorded, and recording that information would give us a sense of the level of resources that are focused on particular areas of policy and decisions. Coming to the end of my presentation, ERCS has recently published a guide on lobbying. It's a free guide which you can download from our website. Thanks, Juliet. The link's in the chat now. The guide covers how lobbying is regulated, how to enforce lobbying laws when they're broken, and how to kind of carry out research and find out about what lobbying has taken place. And the other couple of bullet points there on my slide are just some kind of further reading about how the Act has applied in practice, and they have some more information about the limitations of the 2016 Act. So that's me. I'm going to stop sharing my slides. If I can figure that out. There we are. And I'm going to pass over to Ian Bruce, who's the Ethical Standards Commissioner, for his presentation.
Thanks very much, Ben. I'm just going to share my screen now. I'm going to apologise in advance because this presentation is of necessity dry and technical, but largely that's because the work that we do is somewhat dry and technical. I'll probably start by talking about numbers, and this may inform your discussions later in respect of whether or not the Act itself is doing what it set out to do. Can I just check with the fellow presenters, is this showing okay? Can everyone see this?
It is, Ian.
That's perfect, thank you. So Ben referred to the work that SPICE has done, and I would recommend reading that. It's an interesting piece of research. There won't be time for the provisions of the Act to be looked at again during this parliamentary session. I anticipate probably during the course of the next one, the provisions of that Act will be looked at, and the relevant parliamentary committee to be looking at it will be the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, and they will doubtless be calling for views from members of the public about the way in which the Act has worked in practice to date. So potentially that's something for you all to look out for in future. Anyway, I'll start just with a wee introduction to the work in my office. It's very wide-ranging. There are a number of acts of Parliament that I work to. The Ethical Standards in Public Life, etc. Scotland Act 2000. Now that concerns the conduct of members of boards, so boards of public bodies and their executives and non-executives, and also councillors, so the ethical conduct of councillors, and they have respective codes of conduct that they're expected to adhere to. I investigate complaints alleging that they haven't adhered to those codes of conduct, and following investigation, I report my findings to the Standards Commission for Scotland, which adjudicates on whether or not a breach has occurred and then can reach a decision on sanction. Far and away, the majority of the work that I do is generated by virtue of that Act. Scottish Parliamentary Standards Commissioner Act 2002, and that gives me the powers to investigate complaints about MSPs. And again, that's in respect of whether or not they have complied with the Code of Conduct for MSPs. It doesn't apply to ministers, simply MSPs, and simply when they're acting in that particular capacity as a member of Parliament. And I would suggest that we have considerably fewer complaints of that nature than we do about councillors. But yep, that certainly generates some business for us. I also regulate the process by which individuals are appointed to chair and non-executive positions on the boards of public bodies in Scotland. Roughly 100 of those are regulated, and in the region of 800 posts. And I can investigate complaints that the appointments process wasn't conducted in line with what in this case is a code of practice, which I publish and consult on and refresh relatively regularly. And if I find that that hasn't been complied with in a material regard, then I report to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee again of the Scottish Parliament, who adjudicates on my findings. And finally, at the end of the list, the Lobbying Scotland Act 2016. I have very, very few complaints about this particular act. And when I say very few, I mean, less than a handful every year, and that's been the case since the act came into force. And it's open to anyone to raise a complaint with me, and it's very straightforward for anyone to do so, simply by going onto the website. We've got an online complaint form, so it's a very straightforward matter for people to complain, and my staff are more than happy to assist people if they like to ask technical questions about how to complain. But again, very, very few complaints about the Lobbying Scotland Act come to me, and of those that do, they aren't admissible. But I'll come on to that shortly. For those of you with a particular interest in the way in which we conduct our investigations, all of that is set out in our investigations manual, and there's a section dedicated to the way in which we conduct investigations into complaints about lobbying. So I have a duty to investigate and report on complaints that a person has or might have, and I'll explain what these mean in a little more detail, but fail to comply with Section 8.1 of the Act, fail to provide accurate and complete information in an application made under Section 9 of the 2016 Act, fail to comply with the duty to submit information returns under Section 11 of the Act, or fail to supply accurate and complete information in response to an information notice in accordance with Section 17 of the Act. And you'll doubtless hear from the Registrar's team in respect of some of this. Provisions, so Section 8, that's basically just the duty of those who engage in lobbying to register that activity. Section 9 is to do with their applying for registration. Section 11 is the obligation on all those who do engage in lobbying to submit information returns. And Section 17 is about supplying accurate and complete information in response to an information notice, and that would be a notice issued by the Registrar's team. So, when is a complaint admissible? A complaint is admissible if it's relevant and that it appears at first sight to be about a person who may be or have been engaged in lobbying, and that would be a breach of any of those sections. And it has to meet the conditions set out below pursuant to Section 23.3 of the 2016 Act. So it must be made in writing to my office. It has to be made by an individual and signed by that individual, stating their name and address. But for the purposes of our completing investigations, making a complaint online and ticking a box to say that you've signed it on your own behalf, that's sufficient. So it can be done electronically. It names the person to whom the complaint relates, sets out the facts related to the conduct complained about, and it's made before the end of the period of 1 year, beginning on the date when the individual who made the complaint could reasonably have become aware of the conduct complained about. That's quite important. Sometimes information enters into the public domain by virtue of, for example, a response to a Freedom of Information request, and that information might be a couple of years old. It wouldn't necessarily have been known to a member of the public when the conduct that's of concern arose. So it is open to me to actually look at complaints older than a year old, as long as it's the case that the individual who made that complaint couldn't reasonably have known about the conduct at the time. So please do bear that in mind. If it's irrelevant, rather, then I will dismiss it regardless. If it's relevant but doesn't meet all of the conditions, then I do report to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, and I can then either recommend investigation or dismissal. I think the reason I'm telling you this is simply because something technically, doesn't meet the conditions that are set out in that part of the Act, it wouldn't be right or proper for me simply to dismiss it. So, a report does go to the relevant parliamentary committee. But just to be clear, if I think a complaint does have merit, I will recommend it for further investigation, and that's in all cases. So if it looks as though it's got merit, I will absolutely investigate it, and we can sort out with the complainer via the SPPA committee, ensuring that they are able to provide the sort of technical information that I require in order to proceed with an investigation. 2 stages to an investigation. So stage 1 is assessment for admissibility, and in the majority of cases that I've looked at, they're simply not admissible, and quite frequently that's because there are a number of exemptions in the Act, and quite frequently it's simply because what the complainer believes is regulated lobbying is exempt. Stage 2 is where I conduct an investigation, and again, most of the cases that come before me are knocked out at stage 1 and never get as far as stage 2. Investigations at stage 2 will always result in a report to the SPPA committee, but none have resulted in a report to the SPPA committee thus far. And again, you can reach your own views, perhaps in discussion later, about whether or not the Act is doing what it was intended to do, given that that's where we're at. It may be that the regime as it stands has been successful. It may not. That's not really something for me to offer a view on. As the person who investigates these complaints, I clearly have an interest in whether or not the Act should be revised. So that, I would say, would be a matter for the electorate, for the Scottish Parliament, and for the Scottish ministers. Finally, before a report's submitted, the respondent does have an opportunity to make representations on my findings. I should say as well, and I did share this with the organisers earlier, we are statutorily obliged to conduct both stages of complaints in private. So, that statutory obligation applies to me. I do ask complainers and respondents to respect the confidentiality of the process. They don't necessarily do so, and it's not something that I'm in a position to enforce. But for my own part and for the part of the office, we genuinely cannot share anything until such time as we actually report to Parliament, and the Parliament itself wouldn't share anything until such time as the committee had had an opportunity to review my report and findings and reach its own conclusions. The website address is there. It gives you all the details that you need on how to make a complaint, and it allows you to make your complaint online. The manual I've already mentioned will tell you how we conduct investigations. It also explains how we regulate appointments and discusses our governance and plans. The strategic plan, perhaps most relevant for all of you. It's very, very clear about the way in which I conduct investigations, and that is done without fear or favour. I am statutorily independent of the Scottish ministers and of the Scottish Parliament, and they cannot direct me in relation to how I fulfil my statutory functions. So you can be assured that I'm entirely independent, and my office is very thorough in terms of the investigations that it conducts. Perhaps one final point to make, and maybe you haven't picked this up from my brief presentation, but my investigations are only whether or not the provisions in the 2016 Act have or have not been adhered to. So I am not here to offer a view on whether or not the nature of lobbying that's been conducted is or is not appropriate. That's not my role. It's simply to investigate whether or not the 2016 Act has been complied with. And that's all from me, but I'll be happy to answer any questions later on today.
Thanks very much, Ian. I've certainly got a few questions coming out of that. And just to remind the audience that if you have any questions, you can send them through the chat to me directly, or you can put them in the kind of general chat and we'll pick them up after our next speaker. Moving on to our next speaker, we have James Drummond, who's an assistant lobbying registrar at the Scottish Parliament's lobbying register team. James, over to you, please.
Thanks, Ben. I take it you can see and hear this presentation also?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. I was just taking a couple of notes there just on the back of Ian's comments. So there will be a little bit of crossover, just very briefly, and I'll probably go down the dry and technical route, much like Ian. So good afternoon, everybody. 10 minutes to probably get through a lot, but I do hope I'll give you a good sense of how our team administers the register, and I think it's key to use the word administers. So as the administrators, our primary role manages the day-to-day tasks based on what is set out in the Act and working with the register system that we've got available to us. So at a basic level, the register reflects the day-to-day efforts of organisations that want to seek to inform and influence politicians about the work they're doing or planning to do. And some of that, as we've heard, is specific to the particular concerns of the organisation, and at other times reflects organisations' roles and key political issues within Scotland. And Ben made a very good kind of reference to DRS, which I actually did remove from my own presentation for time. So we feel and hope others do share the view that the lobbying register has helped to provide a level of transparency that was never there prior to its existence. So that will obviously be, I think, discussed as we go on. So I did want to start just with some context of what we do and provide some numbers as part of the presentation. And hopefully I think you've had a sweet spot today in terms of this being the point right where we're pulling together our data for the annual report that we'll publish around September time. And as you see here, I mean, it says it's all still provisional, but it does give you a good idea on the volume and numbers that we're dealing with the number of registrations and information returns that in turn generates. So you can see here we've got 1,385 active organisations at our most recent count. That's been a net increase of 65 organisations from the same time last year, and also takes into account that we've had 43 organisations being made inactive in the same time period. The number there represents a range of organisations from your consultants who operate as sole traders through to multinationals and everything in between. So I think it reflects really the diversity, I would say, of lobbying sectors that are covered by our legislation. So in terms of the numbers of information returns, you can see we are moving rapidly towards 50,000 pieces of lobbying activities published, whether that be substantive or nil returns. And in this last reporting year, I think we're probably looking at our second highest number of publications of just over 8,500. But on that point, I mean, I think it's one thing to have 50,000 returns, but we as a team, we've tried to push organisations as far as we can into ensuring that the information returns do actually have some value. We personally view that an information return and the register as a whole should be clear on what's been conveyed in meetings and conversations that have taken place. And I think if you're a registered organisation on the call today, you'll be familiar with emails coming in from our team that push back and asking for a little more detail in the purpose form, or the purpose part of the form, sorry. So it's not been done to be pedantic or make it hard for organisations. We want the register to be a success, and we want the information in it to be useful, and most of all to aid transparency. So if you do find us pushing back to provide a little more detail, be assured for us it's so that those reading the register publicly have a clear understanding of what's being discussed. Again, just as part of demonstrating the day-to-day for ourselves, we, on here on the screen, I'll show the frame analogy. This is something that we've tried to use and promote in their feedback that we give to organisations since last year. So we review every single return before it's published, and to be perfectly honest, the standard quality and comprehension of these can vary from being really bad to really good content. So This was devised as a means of trying to get organisations to have something that makes them think about what they're writing and try and reduce the number of information returns that we need to send feedback emails on. So, and a lot of that feedback is based on people not knowing whether they've engaged in regulated lobbying, as it's known under the Act. And again, it's one of the key pieces that we have we have to consider whether people have consulted the parliamentary guidance. And in that guidance is the 5 key steps flowchart that you see on screen just now. This for us underpins what regulated lobbying is and what you should consider, something that we created in the very early days, but we think it's still got legs and it's worth highlighting. So in terms of how we run the register, the handling of returns is the biggest part of the job, and key to that is getting organisations to focus on whether they need to submit a form and what they include in it. So a quick brief run through here. So step 1, that's to confirm that there's no written communications, phone calls, tweets, etc. Step 2, so section 2 of the Act sets these functions out, refers to discussions on legislation, government policies, parliamentary questions and motions, matters that you'd expect your MSP would have an interest and awareness of as a representative of the Parliament. Step 3, you're speaking on behalf of the organisation that you're representing. This isn't about you raising matters in a personal capacity. And again, that feeds into step 4. So you must be acting in a paid capacity for the organisation that you're speaking on behalf of. And step 5 is to draw attention to the fact that there are exemptions, which I think Ben mentioned earlier in the Act, and again are set out in the guidance. So you see these here, but I won't go over them in any detail right now, but inevitably I would expect we might have some questions on them later. So we as a team were very much available to assist with these queries on whether organisations should submit the returns, and it really is a big part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. We're keen, very keen to ensure organisations remain compliant. I mean, we're an experienced team, Billy McLaren, the lobbying registrar, and myself. We've been at this from day one, and we've tried to instil into the team a strong culture of providing as helpful and comprehensive advice as we can. And for those of you here today that are already registered, I do genuinely hope that's been your experience when dealing with us as a team. So kind of moving on to compliance, and again, monitoring of compliance is another main factor of the day-to-day running. And when I talk about compliance, I think I'm most often thinking about breaches of the Act. The slide on screen just now, it's more of an overview of what we inform registrants when they apply to join the register. But that third bullet point refers to how breaches most often occur, and that's the failure to submit anything within your most recent statutory reporting period. And where that occurs, we'll issue an email informing of the breach and we'll seek remedial action. There's no tangible penalties at that point for breaching, but since last year's annual report, we've decided that we'll publish all names of organisations that have breached in that reporting year, almost like a naming and shaming aspect to it. So this is the 2023-2024 reporting year breach data. And when I tell you that this takes up 29 pages of our 58-page annual report, then I'm sure you can agree that that's an unhealthily high amount of non-compliance. And what you see here on screen is just a small sample of this. So as it says here, that's page 1 of 29. Believe it or not though, we are actually in a downward trend of the number of breaches over the last 3 years. 2023 had 705, 2024 had 682, and it looks like this year we're going to be at 622. I think part of the reason we believe for this slightly better compliance rate, and I hesitate with those numbers to call it an improvement, is due to letters being sent to chief executives or equivalents of all organisations where we provided a statement of all complete and incomplete activities since an organisation was registered. That spurred a lot of organisations into tidying up a lot of outstanding matters, and it also helped us to publish a lot of information returns which organisations had let fall by the wayside. So in those letters we also highlighted the prospect of having to make use of information notices that would compel action to be taken. That definitely also had an effect. So failure to respond to those notices being issued would see an offence committed under that, and so far we've actually only had cause to issue one of these, and that again had the desired effect of the organisation springing into action. the use of these notices is a bit of a last resort, and I've gone to great efforts to re-engage some organisations into carrying out their statutory responsibilities. But I wouldn't be surprised this year if I'm left with no option but to advise our Chief Executive to sign off on more notices, just to tidy up the remaining straggler registrants that we do still have. So before I finish, just want to briefly highlight two future aspects of our work that's coming up and will be of interest to you, and it's actually already been referenced earlier also. But to finish my thoughts on compliance, just by saying that we are doing what we can to improve performance, but ultimately it really is the responsibility of organisations to be more diligent in fulfilling their statutory requirements. It really needs to be better. So just to round off the contribution, I wanted to inform you that we've managed to secure a budget to develop a new lobbying register system, and that's with the aim of going live after the next Scottish Parliament election in May 2026. We kind of hope to roll out day one after the election takes place. We know the current system isn't ideal. We've always had ambitions to improve it for users, but also for ourselves as administrators and how we manage this. A lot of manual processing. So over the nearly a decade, I mean, we've developed it, we've tweaked it, we've added some improved functionality, but an overhaul is now very much due and necessary. So just as an example, we want to reduce a lot of the administrative effort for users and automate as much of it as we can, and maybe make use of algorithms and AI to aid in the writing of forms by users. So I'd ask you to keep an eye out for further announcements from our team into the summer and autumn on how that's progressing. And just finally, this might have been mentioned, I thought it'd be helpful to say a few words on a long anticipated legislative review of the Act that some of you may have been aware of being in the pipeline. I think it was Ian that mentioned that review still sits in the work plan of the Standards Committee, but like he was saying, with less than a year to go until the Parliament dissolves, I'd be surprised if it was going to take place before then. That's as far as I will commit to where I think it will be. But we're inclined to think that this will fall to the new Standards Committee in the next session. If so, that it could, should, would, hope be one of the first areas of work it turns to. So again, I think that there'll be a lot comes out of today where I would imagine it would be stuff that would feed into that review. So with that, again, hopefully I've kept within the time. It's been hopefully a whistle-stop overview of our work, and like Ian, happy to discuss further in the Q&A session.
Thanks very much, James. So another hint there about a potential review of the 2016 Act in the next Scottish Parliament session. Very interesting. Okay, I've had a couple of questions in the chat. We've got a few minutes to go through those. I'm just going to ask a couple of my own questions before we get into those. So, James, where does that the data that you have about breach reports, where does that come from? Is that from people self-reporting, or is that from the clerk?
That's from us as a team. So just to, again, time didn't allow for the fact to go into the sort of the day in, day out. So we manually record everything. So we use spreadsheets, again, another reason why we want a new system. Everything's held, so we're aware of all the dates. Every organisation has its own registration date. So it's a hard job to monitor almost 1,400 organisations over, I think we're up to 15 statutory return periods now. So we produce that through running reports on the lobbying register system, and then that feeds into what we then will submit as an associated data kind of bulk Excel spreadsheet that goes along with the annual report. So you'll see that come September time, or in previous reports, alongside the annual report, there'll be an associated data. That's everything that we've extracted in terms of performance over that reporting year and cumulative breaches.
That's helpful. And then for you, Ian, so you're saying there are a handful of complaints to the Commissioner each year, and it seems like there's kind of quite an obvious difference between the number of breaches that the clerk's office is recording in terms of the 2016 Act and how many are actually making it to your office. So do you have any ideas as to why there's such a wide disparity there?
I don't. It's probably worth saying, and I didn't mention this, but I am in touch with the registrar. The registrar is in touch with me intermittently. So, you know, we do have discussions about where they are in terms of, you know, like,
I think your audio is very faint there, Ian, for me at least.
how's that? Is that better?
That's it. Yeah, thanks.
All right. Apologies for that. So I am in contact with the registrar. So Billy and James and the team, and we have discussed over the past couple of years, I think, you know, the low rates in terms of, you know, compliance in terms of registration. We are prepared to investigate in the case that the chief executive decides to refer issues to us for investigation. So James mentioned, you know, if an information notice has been issued and someone's failed to get back to the chief executive about that, then clearly there would be scope for that to be referred to my office and an investigation to follow. It hasn't happened yet, but it could happen. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Right, questions from the audience. Neil has asked if there's any equivalent legislation for England and Wales. And Neil, I can answer that quickly. There is one piece of legislation called the Transparency of Lobbying, Non-Party Campaigning and Trade Union Administration Act 2014. I can't tell you very much about what it does and how it compares to the 2016 Act. I don't know if either of the speakers would like to comment on that or add anything for Neil's benefit.
I've popped it in the chat, just a link to the relevant legislation, just below the question. I would suggest the best bet is actually to go and have a look at the SPICE briefing that you've already made reference to, because I'm fairly sure that it discusses equivalent legislations. And we're going to hear from Transparency International later. And I would think of all the organisations that review international standards in respect to lobbying, they're probably best placed to say, you know, I've certainly had a look at their research, where the differences lie.
Thanks very much. Anything to add to that, James?
I would just have a wee look there. We want it's not slightly entirely related to that, and again in terms of the comparison down south. I mean, we do have colleagues in the Office of Registrar Consultant Lobbyists that's kind of based down in the UK. They don't cover anything to anywhere near the same level as us. I don't think they report in the same way in terms of the register that shows you what the activities are. I'm going to use a wee chance to promote ourselves here in terms of the fact that last year the CIPR actually produced a report called No Rules Britannia, and it produced a comparative analysis of our system and the current UK system, along with another 7 countries worldwide. So just to kind of blow our trumpet, I mean, the Scottish Register is 69 times more lobbying organisations per million people registered than the Westminster system. So we're not perfect, and again, I'm sure we'll hear a lot of that, but we do our best to make sure that we're aiding transparency where we can.
Very good. Thanks, James. Juliet, you've got your hand up. Is that a response to this question?
I just thought, yeah, I'd quickly come in. There is yes, as you say, Ben, there is a register of lobbyists at Westminster, but it's only consultant lobbyists. So where you're like an organisation that has clients, so not for in-house lobbyists. So for instance, Ric and myself wouldn't need to register for the Westminster lobby. And also, yeah, all it does is say that you exist. It doesn't actually say what you do. So it's not particularly helpful. Wales have had a couple of consultations in the Parliament where they've thought about introducing a lobbying register, which we at Transparency International, and I'm probably sure that James has also given evidence to them about their proposals. They haven't so far been inclined to introduce such a thing. Obviously, we're hoping that they might do, especially with the increase in members of the Senate coming up next May. So here you go.
Very helpful. So maybe not a kind of a shining example for us to follow. Ric, you've sent me a question. I wondered if you'd like to just ask it rather than have me reading out your question.
Yeah, sure. I have to remember what I said from 10 minutes ago. This was to both of you. I wondered, quite a lot of our research was going through the Scottish Government's publication, the Ministerial Engagements, Travel and Gifts, the spreadsheet that they publish once a month of what ministers are up to. And we found that they were recording information in a really different way to what was on the lobbying register. And sometimes they even appear to be in conflict with one another. And I wondered if you were concerned about that. And additionally, I wondered if you had a view on whether what you thought the impact had been of the Act since 2016 on unregulated lobbying. So if you had expected that things like phone calls and text messages and so on to have increased over the last 9 years.
Okay. Funnily enough, again, for the purposes of time, I actually did remove something about ministerial diary releases as well. The word I used was opaque when it came to that, in terms of what is in a ministerial diary release. Again, it would come back to me saying as administrators, it's not our role to kind of compare and contrast what's on the register with what might be in a ministerial diary. Again, I think that would be something that would maybe more eventually end up at Ian's door if someone was raising a complaint. I think Ian might have a view on that.
Yeah, you'll probably gather, I mean, we have so few complaints that it's impossible for me to draw conclusions about things such as, you know, whether or not unregulated lobbying or lobbying that's exempt, for want of a better expression, has increased as a result of the 2016 Act. I can't even draw conclusions about complaints that are submitted to me because they're so limited in nature. So I can't really assist. I would like to. I suppose I would simply reiterate the point I made earlier about FOI requests. So sometimes they do generate information for people with a particular interest in what's going on. So, you know, if you've got concerns that what's being recorded in terms of ministerial diaries are incompatible with what you're seeing on the register, then my inclination as a member of the public, a concerned constituent, would be to ask questions. You know, that's not me offering a view. It's simply, you know, if you have concerns, ask questions, get the answers that you need. And if you think regulated lobbying's occurred and hasn't been properly registered, then it's at that point in time you can come to my office.
Can I come in as well? And I think in terms of the forms of communication that Ric had mentioned as well, and it was up there front and centre in my slide, that it's oral face-to-face communication. Nothing else is included. Again, I could only offer my, hopefully, experience and opinion that if a review was to come forward in the next parliamentary session, it would certainly be something that I'm sure a lot of people in this day and age would be asking and wondering why we don't extend into these other methods. So again, not for us to give a view in the policy, but I'm sure it would be something that would be part of a review.
Thank you both. One last question before we move on to the next session. And sorry, everyone who's asked a question, we're not going to have time to go through them all. This is from Rose, and it's a question for you, James, which is about the descriptions and meetings in the register.
Yep.
Rose asks, what do you see as the biggest issues with those descriptions, and what's your most used advice or feedback or lessons learned from that process?
I mean, if when you mention descriptions, I go straight to thinking about the actual information return form. So we have a description box and we have a purpose box. There's a lot of repetition or misunderstanding of what we want in the description field. And I can say that this is something that we want to kind of remove for users in terms of the new system that's coming forward. We want to make it a lot more simple and straightforward. So the description box really should just kind of set out a very brief circumstance. So it was a video conference meeting with XY MSP. And you could add in other details. So description there, but the purpose field, if perhaps is maybe more what Rose is asking about, is really about what I was setting out in that frame analogy about things being focused, relevant, accurate, meaningful, and explicit. There's too much in terms of people submitting information which doesn't tell you anything. That's why we push back. So the big thing there is about us trying to get organisations not to write War and Peace, I think you can write a good information return form that tells you exactly what you're speaking about in 2 or 3 sentences. As I say, that focus, relevant and accurate, meaningful, explicit is what we go by. So that would be something I would always say that you should base your writings on. I don't know if that quite answers what Rose was on. I could have misinterpreted why she was asking about description.
Seemed comprehensive to me. Thanks, James. Thank you both for all of that. Okay, we'll draw that first part to a close now and move on to the second part of this webinar, which is really going to be looking at the deficiencies of our lobbying regime. And we're going to start with Ric Lander, who's the Research and Development Manager at Friends of the Earth Scotland. Ric, I hope I've got your job title correct there. Over to you, please, Ric.
Thanks, Ben. Lovely to be speaking with you all. I'm just going to share my slides. I don't think I'm going to be able to see you all while I have the slides up. So, Ben, if there's some kind of a crisis, then can you just interrupt me, please? Thank you. Oh no, I can see you all. Oh, good. Okay, the wonders of technology. If it scratch that, that's fine. If there's any kind of crisis, I'm going to know about it. We're going to have a good time. So yeah, as Ben mentioned, I'm Research and Development Manager at Friends of the Earth Scotland. I'm going to be talking about our work investigating the relationship between fossil fuel companies, particularly oil and gas companies, and the Scottish Government and MSPs. For a little bit of background, at Friends of the Earth Scotland, we're a campaigning organisation and a charity. Our objective is to get Scotland on course for a just transition away from fossil fuels, and particularly one that protects communities and workers. And we do a number of different pieces of work to try and reach this through campaigning on having better public transport, to trying to phase out polluting fossil fuels, including one of our major campaigns at the moment is to stop a new gas-fired power station being built at just outside Peterhead in the northeast of Scotland. And I mentioned that just to help you to appreciate that we do not exist to campaign on transparency and lobbying in of itself. This is so. What this is about how in seeking environmentally and socially just outcomes for society, and trying to encourage our decision makers to change the way our economy and society works to make it more just and environmentally sound. We come up against the actions of private companies and the way in which they interact with decision makers. And so this has been our kind of we can be our kind of case study of that experience. I like to just root us in why we think lobbying is important. Adam Smith has this fantastic quote. He was not a big fan of companies colluding against the public interest, and this is a very basic thing, that if you are trying to make money, then it's often in your interest to get lawmakers to bend or change the rules in your favour, and that's something that we have to guard against. And the sources that we use for our study, and we've been investigating this for something like 2 years, with the lobbying register, which we've talked a lot about today, but also a document we haven't talked so much about, the Ministerial Engagements, Travel and Gifts, which is a monthly spreadsheet that the Scottish Government publishes, and James described it as being opaque, which I think is a reasonable one-word summary of the document, but it's not without merit. It does have some useful things in it, and I think it's well worth people who are campaigning on these sorts of things or monitoring them to be aware of it. In 2023, we did a comprehensive study looking at all of the fossil fuel industry's engagements with the Scottish Parliament. Got a copy of it here. It was called Polluted Politics, the Fossil Fuel Lobby at Holyrood. We reviewed the whole of the lobbying register going back since it was enacted, and also all of the ministers' diaries going back through the current Parliament. And we charted and published all of the engagements that we found, and we came up with some quite striking figures that we found that the fossil fuel industry was meeting MSPs on average 6 times a week, so more than once a day, more than once a working day. And we found 300 meetings where ministers were present. So quite a lot of activity, I think it's fair to say. And as Juliet mentioned, this tends to outshine the impact of citizens and non-governmental organisations when they're pressuring policy. And it did seem that lobbying was intensifying as well. That's registered lobbying. Obviously, we're not able to have an insight on unregistered lobbying, which it seems very likely has increased as well. And we found that companies were getting increasingly clever about making sure that the titles and topics of meetings were in line with Scottish Government policy. For example, making sure Shell or BP that often would begin the conversation by talking about net zero, but would make sure that increased drilling also was kind of included. And as you might expect, most of the registered lobbying was taking place in the Scottish Parliament, but there were some other venues which were really important, and most obviously party conferences, where a huge amount of unregulated lobbying takes place. And I don't feel I have any difficulty saying that because I've been to party conferences and I can see it happening in front of my eyes. And cultural venues as well, so things like award ceremonies, like the Hollywood Magazine annual awards, and things happening at art galleries and things like that. So some examples being, I've already mentioned the SNP conference. During COP26, there was a banquet which the Scottish Government organised for fossil fuel companies focused on hydrogen. It took place at Edinburgh Castle. Kate Forbes met oil company Equinor actually inside the UN climate talks. So some quite striking examples where access is afforded to some of these major private companies. And we got plenty of press coverage and press interest about this, but we wanted quite quickly to work out what this actually meant for us as an organisation that was trying to pursue some outcomes to protect the environment. It's not enough for us to just have people be fed up that they're not being listened to and not that big companies are being listened to instead, right? That's helpful in some respects, but we need to actually make an impact that means that we're protecting the environment. And so we decided to look at a very specific example about how SSE and Equinor, the two developers for this new power station in the northeast of Scotland, to see how they were engaging with the Scottish Government. And we found 28 initially ways in which the Scottish Government's ministerial code was breached through their engagement with these companies. And I can share the link to explain a little bit more about that. But the primary picture was that there was kind of favour being shown towards these two companies where they were being invited into spaces, and it was being suggested that the government would look favourably upon their application. And we made a complaint which went to John Swinney about this and requested an investigation. That was last year. And there was this kind of back and forth with the Scottish Government, where they wrote back to us on several occasions. Following this, we also conducted an investigation about the environmental impact assessment, which is another key part of the way in which the power station's planning process needs to have the environmental impact statement. We found it to be incorrect, and we pursued this, and that was reopened as a result of our campaigning. So we're going to talk more in the following section about how we would like to see lobbying better registered. At the bottom of this, that I do think it's important to underscore that as an environmental justice organisation, we don't think it's private companies should be completely banned from interacting with decision makers. But we do think that if there's a policy priority in a particular direction, then we should have decision makers shouldn't be inviting companies that clearly have a vested interest in eroding that policy outcome. And with climate change, it's fundamentally clear that if your industry is focused on getting fossil fuels out of the ground, then it's to defend your bottom line, you need to stop the Scottish government from acting properly on climate change. That's just straightforward, but basic primary school stuff. And so it's reasonable to regulate those kinds of activities. And I mentioned here the World Health Organization's policy on tobacco lobbying, which is very heavily regulated, and even the previous UK government was quite comfortable with this, to the point where we had Rishi Sunak, in the Conservative manifesto for the previous election, was advocating that we should be banning tobacco products completely. And my view is that you cannot separate a policy proposal like that from the fact that the decision making is shielded from the influence of companies that would seek to erode it. But this, I think one of the maybe important things to say as I close is that this is a huge amount of work. So in the last 2 years, this was one of the biggest things that I was doing over the course of my professional time. And the quantity of information which is on the lobbying register and the minister's diaries is really quite small, and it doesn't paint a picture of what's actually going on. The only way we were able to find out the malpractice which we alleged and complained about to John Swinney, the only way we were able to find that out was doing lots of follow-up freedom of information requests, going through all of these, hundreds of meetings line by line, and asking for additional information about them from the Scottish Government's own records. Extremely time-consuming, not straightforward work to do, very legalistic. And I don't think it's right or fair that the standard procedure is that such a high proportion of meetings are kept on the shelf unless you ask for them, and then you have to wait several months to get the information back. If the First Minister is meeting the CEO of a major company, it's not unreasonable that the information about that meeting should just be lodged in some detail, including the papers and briefings and things like that, in a place where the public can see them. That would be my view. So there's a lot that can be done to tighten these kind of procedures up. But I would encourage you to have a look at what we've done if you're interested in winning environmental and social campaigns, and you think that corporate lobbying is something that is actually holding back what you're trying to achieve. I think we've had a good amount of progress in doing that at Friends of the Earth Scotland, and it's well worth pursuing if you can.
I agree, Rick, and thanks very much for that. We'll move on to our final speaker, Juliet Swann, who is the Nations and Regions Programmes Manager at Transparency International UK. And our presentation, you can see what our presentation is going to cover. Over to you, Juliet. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thanks for having me today. So yeah, my name's Juliet Swann. I'm Nations and Regions Programme Manager, as Ben just said, at TI UK. For those of you who are unfamiliar with TI, we are the global anti-corruption movement with over 100 chapters on every continent. So I work for the UK chapter, leading our work in Scotland. In the UK, we work on corruption both in terms of what we call dirty money, so like illicit finance flows that see oligarchs and kleptocrats buying up property in the UK, including in Scotland, but also on political integrity issues that serve to protect our domestic politics from corruption risk. So things like lobbying transparency. We were involved in lobbying to introduce the Lobbying Act. And as I said in the chat, we're proud to say it does lead the UK in terms of lobbying transparency, but would love for it to do better. So hold on, please go forwards. There we go. So I'm going to talk about a few different aspects of the lobbying register. Some of them have been covered briefly, and I'll probably talk a little bit more about those and where we think changes might improve. So I'm going to cover the actual activity of lobbying, as we've talked about, what types of communication are and aren't included. I'm going to cover some of the other exemptions, but only in brief because for shortness of time. Also, I'm going to touch on how we might get better insights on how much is being spent on lobbying activity. That's been referred to as well, and also on reporting timescales. I'm then going to briefly touch on how lobbying transparency might be made more accessible and user-friendly. Before I jump into that, we've sort of covered this, but just a quick reminder of why lobbying transparency really matters. Aside from the democratic legitimacy of providing the public with the opportunity to see who has influenced decision-making, understanding how influence is being sought and wielded can provide important campaign insights, as Ric has so comprehensively laid out. And having rules around integrity and decision-making and public life means those of us seeking to ensure democracy works for all of us and specifically delivers social justice and equality can leverage those laws to demand equality of access, influence, and a better seat at the table. So our recent publication, Power Politics, reveals inequality in lobbying from the oil and gas sector versus environmental NGOs, both at Westminster and in Scotland. And Ben has already kindly mentioned this blog I wrote a while ago about the intense lobbying activity from the whiskey lobby around the deposit return scheme. Knowing that this has happened might not change the outcome, but it does give us a real insight into lobbying techniques that civil society might be facing, and at least to some extent, knowledge is power. So what do we know? So firstly, types of communicating. Our lobbying register, as people have touched on, is based on instances of lobbying, so not sort of what your overall campaigning might be across the piece, but individual occasions where lobbyists seek to influence decision makers. And as has been mentioned, only certain types of communication are covered by the register. And I have to say thank you to Jamie Mann from the Ferret for this next series of slides, which I have stolen from him. So traditional in-person meetings are covered by the lobbying register, so a face-to-face meeting where you sit down and chat to somebody. And that face-to-face definition also includes video calls, as mentioned. But as Ben said, the Zoom loophole means if you turn your camera off, not lobbying. Phone calls, they don't count, nor do emails or letters. Now, the Republic of Ireland's lobbying register does cover oral, written, and any other communication with decision makers, however made. And Canada also includes verbal or written communications. Even countries with less comprehensive lobbying legislation, including America, they do include oral and written communications in their definitions. So at TI, we definitely think at a minimum, phone calls or closing that Zoom loophole should be included, and ideally emails and letters as well. And I have some thoughts on that because I'm sure you all do too. As again, has been mentioned, the Act provides for a number of exemptions, some of which are listed here. I'm not going to go into them, but I am going to say that basically the post-legislative discussions that have been had with the Standards Committee have really shown that some of these exemptions are really quite confusing. And often organisations are voluntarily recording meetings that are exempt. And as James has said, the lobbying registrar team then have to reject them, which seems kind of counterproductive. So we would agree with the recommendations from that Holyrood Committee that these should be revisited and looked at again. On to money. Unlike lobbying transparency registers in the EU and the US, and indeed international good practice standards, in Scotland, we don't provide any information about the amounts spent on relevant activities by those seeking to influence key decisions. Now, this can give the impression that there is equal opportunity for organisations and groups to represent their views to ministers and MSPs, when in reality, as we all know, there might be a substantial disparity in the resources that they're using. So whilst money doesn't necessarily equate to access and influence, it's clearly a relevant factor when considering how wealthy vested interests might choose to allocate their resources, and it should therefore be subject to public scrutiny. Again, international comparisons. EU rules require lobbyists to report annual costs for activities covered by the register, and the US requires lobbyists to report good faith estimates quarterly. Again, previous Holyrood evidence sessions have discussed different possible ways of recording expenditure. At TI UK, we think that better understanding of financial outlay would really help provide a clearer view of the relationship between money, access, and potential influence, and whether and how money is disproportionately affecting equal and meaningful participation in Scottish democracy. For instance, even getting into this business event at Scottish Labour Conference, which was closed to the media, costs between £550 and £800, and that's before any costs of exhibiting either inside the business event or in the main conference. And as Ric said, who knows what else is going on. This is a collage from the 2024 Holyrood Magazine Garden Party at the Botanic Gardens. Looks like a fun evening, doesn't it? My invite must have got lost in the post. But look whose invites didn't get lost in the post. A veritable who's who of corporate interests and lobbyists. And at TI, we would argue that knowing how much these organisations spent to get that access is a vital part of the transparency puzzle. Credit to the 10 out of 37 organisations who at least recorded their conversations in the lobbying register. I guess the rest of them just talked about the weather. Hold on, oh yes, so this is the 10 who did record this is a sneak preview of something I'm going to talk about later, which confused me. There we go. On to reporting timescales. Timely disclosure of lobbying activity is also essential for a full understanding of how influence is being wrought on policy development. Currently in Scotland, we're only required to report on activities at 6 monthly intervals, which again is much less frequent than Ireland, the US, or Canada. It's also less frequent than even the ministerial meetings data sets that Ric referred to, which, as he said, are a monthly assessment reported quarterly. So ideally, reporting of lobbying should be as soon as reasonably practicable. And again, there are good practice international standards on this that suggest quarterly. So we do think that changing that and shortening it to every quarter would be a definite improvement. Just to test this proposal, I looked at the reporting time lags in the lobbying register for all meetings in 2024. Just over half were already being declared within the quarter. So that suggests that moving to a mandated quarterly reporting schedule wouldn't be too disruptive. And in fact, almost 25% of 2024 meetings were reported within a calendar month. But of course, even the best lobbying register needs to be usable. And as James said, there is a collective acknowledgement that 9 years on, the web interface of the lobbying register could be improved. I would like to say that the Registrar and his team have made really useful improvements with what they have at their disposal. And I'm pleased to have that confirmation that the budget has been approved for the improvements post the next election. Really excited about that. This isn't just a Scottish problem. Transparency data sets generally can be frustrating and piecemeal, as well as suffering from a lack of consistency across data inputs. Now I'm going to see if this works handily. There we go. In an attempt to make both accessing and analysing, oh no, don't do that. Oh, can you still see the open access website? Yes, thanks, Ric. So in an attempt to make both accessing and analysing lobbying data easier, but also to show how even with a small budget, it's possible to do slightly better than government is doing at the moment, at TI UK, we have for a number of years been pulling together data from across Whitehall departments, all of which report separately, their ministerial meetings data separately. And as I said, this isn't lobbying data, this is just ministerial meetings. Credit to my colleague Rose, who is on the call, who painstakingly gathers and uploads this data every quarter for the UK, which is what you can see here. Since February this year, thanks to a grant from the Waverley Street Foundation, this open access website now includes Scottish lobbying register data, so you can compare and contrast it with Westminster. We also set up tags for meetings, so you can filter by topic. We have topics of climate, health, housing, and defence, and we're hoping to introduce more there as well. So this is basically just a slightly more a lot more user-friendly version of both the ministerial meetings data from Westminster and Scottish lobbying data. It doesn't yet include Scottish ministerial meeting data, mostly because, as Ric will tell you, those spreadsheets are a nightmare. It doesn't include Welsh lobbying data because in Wales, they put the information in English and Welsh in the same cell on an Excel spreadsheet. Thanks, Wales. Anyway, just going to go back to my presentation now, which is here. So there are a number of other tools at our disposal to improve transparency of influence at Holyrood. Ric mentioned freedom of information requests. Providing more detail of meetings proactively, again, as Ric said, would be helpful, both in terms of the information available in that ministerial meetings data set and potentially in publishing MSP diaries, because that way you'd sort of be able to see both sides of the equation and work out where there were maybe gaps and be able to actually sort of make more reporting to Ian and his team. This is especially worth noting because the backstop of freedom of information isn't applicable to MSPs, so they can choose to share information if requested, but they don't have to. I haven't touched on the revolving door. I know Ian mentioned it's better up here than it is down in Westminster, but we do still see ex-MSPs moving into positions where they could be lobbying their former colleagues and they keep their parliamentary pass, so we don't really know what they're doing. And I haven't taken us down the geekiest of the rabbit holes, which are my favorite part, but we can do that another time maybe, which is cross-database synchronicity, where I have this dream where every organization has like a unique ID that you can track it across every data set. Or legislative footprints, where the annex to a bill includes sort of all the interventions that have been made by different organizations. Of course, because hindsight is 2020, if I was asked to design a better lobbying register now, I probably wouldn't start from here, but would consider a more organizational objectives and campaigning priorities approach similar to the Canadian register. This slide, which I'm not going to talk through, provides an idea of what I might ask for, and I can certainly make sure these slides are available to circulate afterwards. But that's it. I'm going to leave that there. Really here to keen comments and reflections. Also really keen to discuss some of the ideas I've got there, because at TI we are really concerned that reforms should be pragmatic and useful. They shouldn't just be there for reform's sake. But again, I would say, to be fair, we are doing much better than the other UK nations.
Thanks very much, Juliet. That was excellent. We don't have any questions in the chat, so a question for you, Juliet. You've kind of given us a comprehensive list of the features of the 2016 Act and other aspects of lobbying laws in Scotland that could be improved. And I just wondered, is that something that your organisation is working on, particularly with a view to the next Scottish Parliament elections?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is yeah, it's taken a long time to get here, hasn't it? As James said, the post-legislative scrutiny that was sort of built into the Act in 2016, that took place in 2021. And unfortunately, despite a very good list of recommendations from the committee, hasn't had any further follow-up yet. So, I mean, at a basic level, we'd want to see some of those recommendations from that parliamentary committee introduced, but we do think that as we've waited another 5-6 years, there are other things that we've learned from the way the lobbying register has operated since then that we could also look to see improving. So I do actually have an event scheduled in the Scottish Parliament on September the 3rd. So make your diaries. But yeah, hopefully sort of, I think as James and Ian have both alluded to, we're minded to recognise that there isn't really enough time in this parliamentary session to get anything done now. So it is going to be post 2026. So I think, yeah, in the run up to the election, sort of trying to sort of think about ways to engage with candidates and let them know what lobbying is like and what lobbying transparency looks like. And I think just sort of question some of those assumptions, because as I said, a lot of them are actually quite confusing and people think that actually more is lobbying than isn't. And yeah, all of that.
Thank you. Are there, just a wee follow up on that, are there any signs that any of the parties are going to have changes to lobbying regulation in their manifestos, or is it not something that
not that I've managed to get confirmation of as yet. It's always one of those difficult issues, isn't it? It's turkeys voting for Christmas is a phrase that comes to mind, but also I think it's difficult, and I think Ric has done a really great job of sort of laying out why lobbying transparency is important for actual day-to-day issues that are of concern to us all, that it isn't just a technical issue of transparency for transparency's sake. It's because it really sort of gets to the heart of how policy decisions are made and who is really sort of in the room when those policy decisions are made. And I think that's the sort of hard part, is making politicians see that issues on the doorstep actually do link to lobbying transparency, rather than it, yeah, because I mean, as I said recently, it's not rocket science, right? We all know why policies that could actually advance social and economic justice aren't happening. And it's because vested interests are preventing them from doing so. It's not, yeah.
That's such a good point, and I think something that both of your organisations have done really well with the Polluted Politics report and your Spirited Away and other reports, Juliet, is kind of brought that to life, and you've sort of drawn out the the real life implications of lobbying and its impact on policy. Okay, Ric has asked you a question, Juliet, and it's what would you like to see done to clean up party conferences?
Oh my goodness, that's a giant question. I think just a lot more transparency about how much people have paid. I mean, obviously, we sort of know because when you see the conference handbooks, you know how much it's going to cost you to run a fringe or have an exhibition stand. But when you see sort of organizations who've rented out like almost half the hall in the exhibition stand, you're like, well, how much did that cost? And, what were you guaranteed as part of it? And who were you actually able to speak to? I also think that a lot of the time, those meetings aren't reported as lobbying because they're deemed to be like party political rather than, government or policy making. And I'm like, yeah, because obviously John Swinney takes off his First Minister hat and just talks to somebody about, Equinor or Peterhead and then puts it back on again afterwards. And it's completely party political and nothing to do with actually his role as First Minister. So there's something about that as well, like just a little bit more honesty, if you will, about how those conversations are being had in those sort of what are called social or party political situations.
Maybe we need a lobbying police squad to attend conferences and record these and then send on complaints to the Ethical Standards Commissioner. Ric, do you have any ideas on that? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, certainly you can do a quick sweep of like LinkedIn and all the pictures that some of the consultant lobbyists posted, like, look who we spoke to at party conference. And you're like, it's not in the lobbying register though, is it? What did you talk about? Yeah.
Ric, do you have any thoughts on your own question?
I mean, I feel like they're so mired that it's really hard to work out where to start. I genuinely think it's something we should be embarrassed about as a country. I don't know how many folk I've spoken to who've been really shocked when they go to a party conference. And my main experience is with Labour and the SNP, but just the visibility up front and centre of private companies, some of the world's largest corporations, welcomed in, wined and dined, special reception here, special reception there. You can't come in this room. This room's just for business people. Oh, well, the First Minister's got a special meeting with this person from this company, that company, a round table with these folk from the energy industry, the healthcare, private healthcare sector, etc., etc. And it's really offensive that people pay their subs and then they come all the way, across the country. They take leave, ordinary members of political parties, and then this is what they're faced with. I just think it's really despicable behaviour. But the pattern, of course, is that we have the way that we have party political funding in this country. There's no public funding available. And so the parties are drawn into accepting these kind of lucrative deals with private companies. I just personally feel like it's something people should be much more agitated and fed up about. And I think we have a strange aversion to kind of constitutional and governmental governance reforms in this country, as if that's not bread and butter stuff. We need to be getting on with the day-to-day business of government. And of course, every time that choice is made, it favours Nestle and Shell and so on, because they're quite comfortable with the way things are currently. I think that probably party funding ultimately is one of the key things, but I am surprised it's not more of a scandal. If I was a journalist, I feel like it would be one of the key things I write about. But that may also speak to the fact that we have so few investigative journalists left in the UK, unfortunately, which is another conversation.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and shout out to the Ferret for being a really good investigative news outlet in Scotland. I think, obviously on party funding, that's something that we're working on quite diligently at Westminster, to sort of set caps on how much individuals and companies can donate, and also sort of restricting it so it can't be foreign companies who are donating or people like Elon Musk. But I think, like you'll see that some organizations will declare their corporate sponsorship of a party conference in their as a donation to a political party, and some don't. So I'm not even sure how to square that circle, or even like get to the bottom of, how much is being spent by whom, where. So yeah, even the transparency of it is really low. And then, as Ric says, yeah, just the reliance on that money from big business. I mean, they're not going to spend that money without any quid pro quo, are they? So
yeah, and just to give a specific example of policy impact there, it's sort of 5 or 6 years since we had a huge amount of public and wider interest in climate change, when we had things like Extinction Rebellion and the school kids going on strike, and we had COP26 come to Glasgow, and Boris Johnson declared himself to be a kind of crusader against coal, all these things which maybe seem quite distant now. But there was a clear signal which was heard by legislators that the action on climate change was a very high priority and things needed to be set in motion. And the incoming UK Labour government clearly felt that that was something that they needed to respond to as well. And there was an expectation that we were going to have tens of billions of pounds of investment in some kind of green investment in things like renewable energy and green jobs. And the main thing which has actually come out of that is a £10 billion plus investment in carbon capture and storage, which is the oil and gas industry's pipe dream come true. That is their solution. There's been no serious new money in things like community renewable energy or fixing heat or our leaky buildings or public transport. None of those things are on the agenda because oil and gas companies are not lobbying for them. So, it's hard to find the smoking gun when you're trying to chart that path, but it's pretty darn obvious, like when you talk to someone on the street, like what's going on. And yeah, we should be really pretty angry that our legislators are spending. When we get angry about something, their response is to call up one of the top 10 companies in the world and ask them what to do about it, rather than actually coming up with a just and fair response.
Thank you. Very comprehensive answers. I think a final question just to finish us off, and this is probably quite a nice one to finish on, which is from Anne. And it's about whether there'll be another Q&A for civil society organisations to understand how we can work in coalition. I'm not going to read the rest of the question, but you can see it, Juliet and Ric. And Juliet, I wonder if this is maybe a chance for you to plug your parliamentary event, and if either of you know of any other events coming up on this subject, please chip in.
Yeah, so we've been planning an event to talk about improving the lobbying register for a while, and we're hoping it will take place on the 3rd of September in Holyrood. So I'll share that with ERCS and they can share it with you guys, however that happens. I guess the trick is, right, to just really try and make that link, as Ric and I have both said, between like what is seen as a technical issue and a system change issue to actually the day-to-day issues that are important to you as representatives of small civil society organizations, or even just members of the public in the electorate, and that you do want to see accountability to how these decisions are made. And the best way to do that is to sort of take what we've done, which is, as I say, UK leading, and make it better. And we could be quite radical, like including financial information in there would be really radical, and quite brave. So yeah.
Good point to end on. Thank you. Anything else from you, Ric? Okay, well, we'll draw things to a close there. Just a few kind of final points just to finish off, just to say thank you to each of our 4 speakers for their excellent presentations and spirited responses to all of those questions. Much appreciated. I hope that you enjoyed this as an audience. Thank you also to Julia and Zoe, who've been working away in the background to make this webinar actually work and to keep it running on the day. Much appreciated to you both. And yes, I hope that you all enjoyed this. Just a few kind of points before we finish. We've got our guides to lobbying available on our website for free. If anyone is interested, you can find it there. It'll also be shared by email after this webinar. The recording will be shared in the next few weeks with all of the attendees as well. If you need any legal advice on any of the matters that we've covered, you're welcome to get in touch with our advice service and we can have a chat about that. And there's a feedback form, which I think has just been shared in the chat, yes, by Julia. We'd be grateful if you could fill that in. So thank you very much, everyone. And that's us.